In the aftermath of the First World War, Ukraine saw much turmoil on its territory. The fight for independence was a fight that went hand in hand with the fight against the Soviets, as well as the southern front of the Russian Civil War, and also the fight against Poland, not to mention the involvement of the French Allied Intervention Force in Odessa. The Ukrainian People's Army was led by Ukrainian nationalist Simon Petliura, who was fighting against impossible odds and eventually find its demise at the hands of the Reds. In this video, you are going to learn about Ukraine's army during its War of Independence. Keep watching. After the February Revolution, the Ukrainian Rada was established and declared itself loyal to the provisional government. Yet, after the October Revolution, they declared themselves independent as the Ukrainian National Republic, the UNR, also known as the Ukrainian People's Republic. Local Bolsheviks set up their rival government in Kharkiv. The UNR managed to get recognition by the Central Powers. The Bolsheviks did capture Kiev, but in February 1918, the Central Powers moved into Ukraine and the Bolsheviks signed the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, therefore recognizing the UNR. Yet, in April, the Germans installed a new puppet government led by Pavlo Skoropadsky. When the Central Powers were defeated in the First World War, the Germans left Ukraine as well as Skoropadsky. The UNR was re-established. Meanwhile, in the west, in an area called Eastern Galicia, former Austro-Hungarian territory, the West Ukrainian People's Republic was proclaimed in Lviv. In the following year, the West Ukrainian state found its demise at the hands of the Poles in the Polish-Ukrainian War. The UNR would eventually be defeated by the Reds. Therefore, the largest part of Ukraine became part of the USSR, and Western Ukraine became part of the new Second Polish Republic. So let's take a look at the Ukrainian People's Army, also known as the Ukrainian National Army, which was the army of the UNR. After the February Revolution and the collapse of Tsarist Russia, Ukrainian militias began to be formed spontaneously. Later, this was sanctioned by the Ukrainian General Military Committee and it was endorsed by the provisional government. Russia remained at war with the Central Powers, and after the Bolshevik takeover, which is also known as the October Revolution, the Ukrainian Rada proclaimed its independence, and thus the Ukrainian People's Republic, or the Ukrainian National Republic, the UNR, was born. The Ukrainian units were recalled to Ukraine. This, however, wasn't too successful. The only Ukrainian units under effective Rada's control were the 1st Ukrainian and the 2nd Zaporozhian Sich Corps. An attempt was made to form the other returnees into two Serdyuk Guard divisions in November 1917. These comprised the Chelmnitsky, Polubotok, Doroshenko, Bohun, and Nalyavyka regiments, a St. George regiment, a cavalry regiment, an artillery and engineer unit. However, they were quickly disbanded again. Russia at that time was still in war with the Central Powers. Now, not all Ukrainian soldiers came from Russian Ukraine. Others came from Eastern Galicia, Western Ukraine, that was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Some of these Ukrainians were POW'd by the Imperial Russian forces and were now interned in a prison camp in Kiev. Some of these served as Sich Riflemen, which was a Ukrainian unit within the Austro-Hungarian army. And then there was also a Ukrainian volunteer unit named the Free Cossacks. The Rada's attempt recalling its Ukrainian units led to a break with the Bolshevik government. The Reds, who had set up their rival government in Kharkiv, they launched an offensive and they seized Kiev. The Ukrainian Rada had a trump card and then turned to the Central Powers, who had recognized the UNR and came marching in with 35 divisions. Among these divisions were Ukrainian Sich Riflemen. Some of the Ukrainian volunteers also helped the Central Powers, and thus the UNR was reinstated. The Rada had plans to raise a conscript army. However, since the Rada was overthrown in April 1918, these plans were abandoned. Now the Germans, they raised a so-called Blue Coat Division, which consisted of Ukrainian POWs. There was also an Austrian equivalent named the Grey Coat Division. There seemed to be no standard uniform at the time. It is very likely that the former Tsarist soldiers wore their Imperial Russian uniforms and weapons such as the Mosin Nagant. Others had makeshift insignia with the national colors yellow and blue. In April 1918, the UNR was overthrown to make way for the Hetmanate of Ukraine, led by Russian-speaking former Tsarist officer Pavlo Skoropadsky. That month, the Russian-looking tunic, the gimnastirka, was abolished to make way for more French-looking uniforms. Older garments remained in use though, and I read that the Free Cossacks had their own uniforms. Did you know that at the time there was great enthusiasm for the Cossack style of uniform? Under Skoropadsky, a new Ukrainian army had to be formed. Now, the Sich rifles and the Bluecoats, they opposed Skoropadsky and were thus disbanded. In July, another Ukrainian army came into existence, which consisted of volunteers and upper-class peasants. Its officers were mostly former Tsarist officers, and they modeled their tunic to the former Imperial Russian army. By November 1918, this army had around 60,000 soldiers in its ranks. Now do notice that Skoropadsky's regime was backed by German military presence. In December, a new directory re-established the UNR, now dominated by army leader Simon Petliura, who established friendly ties with the neighboring West Ukrainian People's Republic. The collapse of the Hetmanate was only survived by the Zaporozhian Corps and Grey Coat elements. Furthermore, the new forces consisted of a multitude of small guerrilla units who were either disbanded, turned to banditry, or switched sides to the Reds. The directory had 40,000 regular troops and 100,000 guerrillas. Universal mobilization was declared, but there were no means to put it into effect. The UNR had many enemies to deal with: the French in the south, the Whites in the east, the Reds in the north, and the Poles in the west. They came to terms with the French, who advised them to work together with the Whites. However, White commander Anton Denikin refused to work together with what he saw as Ukrainian separatists. After losing ground in May 1919, an armistice was signed with the Poles, and also the West Ukrainian Army, known as the Galician Army, joined the ranks of the UNR. That summer, Denikin's forces moved towards Moscow. In August, they entered Kiev together with the Ukrainian Galician Army. This was the army of the West Ukrainian People's Republic that was driven out of the area by the Poles. Later, Denikin forced the West Ukrainians to leave and proceeded with anti-Ukrainian measures in the capital. The directory of the UNR rejected the Whites, and Petliura came to terms with the Poles. Denikin's advance came to a halt thanks to the actions of Makhno's army, and on the 16th of December, Kiev was taken by the Reds for the third time. In May 1920, Poles and Ukrainians captured the city. However, their lines were overstretched, and due to a Red Army counterattack, they had to pull back. Mid-June, the Reds took the city again. They eventually turned against the blacks of Nestor Machno. Machno himself got away to Romania. After the Poles signed an armistice with the Reds, the UNR army had 39,000 men, 8,000 horses, 675 machine guns, 74 artillery guns, 2 armored trains, and 3 aircraft. This offensive did very little and was quickly defeated. They remained in Galicia, which became Polish with the Riga Treaty of March 1921. The Ukrainian People's Army dispersed, and some of its commanders joined the Polish army. And this was the effective end of the Ukrainian People's Army. Under Directory rule, there was an attempt to apply the style of Skoropadsky's army to the whole Ukrainian People's Army. A dress uniform consisted of a fur black cap with a white plume. The new uniform was inspired by the Grey Coat divisions, which origins lied in the former Austro-Hungarian Army. Early 1919, a new metal cockade was introduced with the flag colors, although I read it was never issued. In the summer of 1919, a new khaki uniform appeared with peaked cap, tunic with 4 patch pockets and breeches. The cockade was reintroduced that summer. Different color patches were introduced, as you can see on this photo. All in all, there was a great variety in practice. Pavlo Shandruk notes that in early 1919, only 1 in 10 men of his unit had good shoes, and that most wore civilian clothing, though he later succeeded in obtaining uniforms and steel helmets for them in Kiev. And they used the Russian Adrian helmet. Here you have an army with a great variety of standards. An army of a nation that wasn't becoming a nation for many decades to come. Thanks to my patrons, you see their names on the screen. A special thanks to Liam Devlin, Damian Wallace, Connor, Philip Jordan, Jakob Muslund, Nick Terranova, Haley Mark Lil Hale, Janusz Dojimkiewicz, Joanne, Justrin Turbell, Tanya Dixie, Henry Clarkson, Rob Park, Andrea Martic, Susanna Di Bella, John Beach, Luis Becerra, Fernando Lopez Ojeda, and Mike West. If you want to have the full story of why Ukraine failed to achieve independence after the First World War, you can click right here. And if you like to learn more about Ukrainian collaboration with the Germans in the Second World War, click right here. Well, thank you for watching. Do not forget to subscribe. See you later.